This is the Bitcoin Made Simple podcast. Here's your host, Corey Tusick.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. On this week's episode, I interviewed the guy on Twitter known as LogScale. LogScale started hosting Twitter Spaces over the summer, and on those Twitter Spaces, we're talking just about Bitcoin, and it became pretty popular. A lot of people were in and out. Sometimes the stages would get pretty big, and I actually met him that way. So I wanted to talk to him about that, his background, how he got into that, and then how he got into Bitcoin as well. And then also there was this whole controversy of, him getting memed towards the end of summer, and it made him almost walk away from everything. But then he decided to come back. So I wanted to get him to be able to tell his side of the story, and then also, shed light on where he's going. Because now he's, changing his Twitter handle is basically going to now be a Bitcoin radio station, which is pretty cool. Like interactive radio, everybody can come on, and for newbies or anybody, always check in and listen to different people talking about different things in the Bitcoin world. So I wanted to we discuss all that, and then also got into his theories on why the US might adopt Bitcoin. This episode is brought to you by Movies Plus. Movies Plus is my streaming platform that I started over the summer. And we have content going up all the time. If you want to go and check it out for free, you can do a 30-day free trial. Just go to the App Store, search Movies Plus, download the app, and start the free trial. Bitcoin content is going up. We're actually going to start probably adding some podcasts there too as well. If you want to check them out, be in front of the paywall. So even if you're just looking for a different place, and then also we will have an exciting announcement soon, but I think we're pretty close to landing our first comedy special. So we'll have a comedian coming on board and having a Movies Plus original. So keep your ears and eyes peeled for that. And then also it is brought to you by Coinbeast Connect. Do you have questions about Bitcoin? Personalize your learning and book a one-on-one video call with a Bitcoin Pro on Coinbeast Connect. Learn about mining, security, the Lightning Network, DeFi, taxes, and many other topics. It's really easy. Choose your topic and pro, select a date when you're available, and bring your questions to the meeting room. Book your first call today by going to coinbeast.com and clicking on the Connect tab. Be prepared for the financial revolution and get the knowledge you need. If you want to follow me, just follow me at Corey_Tusick on Twitter. And if you want to follow the show, it's at Bitcoin Simply. And you can email the show at bitcoinmadesimplepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks. So, I guess to throw another log on the fire and keep this conversation going, I had to get that pun out of the way. Yes. You become quite the name in the Bitcoin space, and I'm sure you didn't see that coming at all.
No, I didn't. This was all unplanned.
So to get into your background, because I asked you one time on a Twitter Spaces, and you mentioned a little bit about what you do in your fiat job, your fiat mining. So give the listeners a little bit of a background on who LogScale is, and your origin story, how you got into this.
Right. Well, my fiat mining, as I have a business that I've had for almost a couple decades now, and it doesn't need my attention every day. Which allows me to, sometimes explore other interests, which is, I guess, what I've been doing since I really went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And, it was May of this year when Twitter Spaces started, and that was the same time that, Bitcoin had taken its big dive. And so initially I joined some spaces thinking, well, this is interesting. And I'm kind of like, I'm a verbal person. I like to talk, and I want to really understand Bitcoin better, because I had a bunch of money in it that just is now a lot less money. And so, I first bought Bitcoin in February of 2017, and I sold it that December, never really understanding it. I got
taking like a decent profit, I mean,
yeah.
not, but don't feel guilty because a lot of people did that.
Yes.
I wasn't even in at that point. So
Okay. And then, when COVID came and the stock markets tanked, I got interested in Bitcoin again. And this time I began taking it seriously. And it was Raoul Pal that I can credit at that point in time anyway. And so I started understanding it like as a macroeconomic asset and how it played into the global situation, and recognizing that, okay, people like him and other people in this field and leaders in the investment world are taking it seriously and institutions are getting in. So I kind of had a basic understanding of it from that perspective, for about a year. And then in May, after, the big correction, I got on Spaces, and I was on Spaces for hours a day, just like absorbing as much as I can, and pretty much became orange pilled, into being a Bitcoin maximalist in those first couple of weeks of Spaces. And then I started hosting more of them for no reason other than, people wanted to talk for like 8, 10 or more hours a day, but they would have to keep shutting down their Spaces because, life called, or their significant other often. And not everyone was able to host Spaces at the beginning for whatever reason. Twitter, gave certain accounts the ability to host Spaces and not others. And so I'm like, well, I can host, and I'm single now, so I can host for hours. So it was just that random circumstance that I could host, and B, didn't have anybody telling me I needed to get off.
How do you get off the phone?
Yes. So that led to me hosting regularly, and early on, I because I was looking to learn more, since other people knew more than I did, I was, inviting people who knew more to the stage. And I think it was in the first week or two of hosting regularly, I think the tweet's still around, I posted a tweet saying, hey, this is my strategy for hosting. I'm going to try to optimize the speaker panel so that there's higher signal to noise, and don't be offended if I move you off the panel because you've been quiet. And so I kind of took this approach toward very actively managing the panel
instead of just starting it up and letting it run.
Yes. Well, there was a week or two where I just kind of let it run, but then I think I sort of pivoted and I started really actively managing the panel, inviting people, and that kind of grew. If the topic went off in a certain direction, I'd be DMing people who I knew that was their niche. Hey, we're talking about whatever. Can you come join the stage? And so I kind of took this role rather than as so much of a speaker as a director, or a casting director, and okay, who can I get on stage to make this interesting, or who's waiting to as the spaces got larger, who's waiting to speak, who I think has a lot to offer based on the topic or based on past Spaces, but there's other people on stage who aren't really contributing much right now. And so I just kind of made the policy, hey, if I bump you down to listener, that's not personal. You can just request again if you have more to say. And so that worked. That increased the signal to noise ratio of my Spaces and generally made them, the highest signal noise ratio, unless Bitcoin Magazine opened up a space on some topic, then that's obviously going to be high quality content. But so kind of my Spaces gained a reputation for okay, this is where the big brains are. This is where the most useful information is. And then once I reached that point in time, it just kind of snowballed from there. And my Spaces kind of still have that reputation for being high signal to noise. And now I'm my role is kind of gravitating again. And now I'm moving more into a producer role, where, okay, I've now got a sponsor and it's Twitter. And there might be, more sponsors down the road. So what if I build this up, invite more people to bring their content, and kind of take the log scale out and move that to a new account and make this more like a neutral platform where people can come, and be heard by a larger audience. And so I'm kind of like looking at my role more like a producer / director now. And so I expect to generally talk less as time goes on. There's one, topic where I've considered myself quite knowledgeable because I like really dove into it. And that's what is going on with the US government and Bitcoin. And so, I had some threads on that topic that went really viral and brought me, a lot of my followers came from that as opposed to Spaces. And I've got more on that coming up soon. So that's one topic where, I'll go out and speak. Like I was invited onto a stage and discuss that with Lynn Alden, had a couple thousand people in it. And that piece I wrote on that was published in the Swan Bitcoin private client newsletter. But a lot of that hasn't been published, for everyone to read. And a lot of what I found since then wasn't in that article. So, that's one area where I think I have unique and valuable content to add. But other than that, I'm like, I think I tweeted about this a few weeks ago. I don't see myself as an influencer, but I don't have problems with influencers. And I'd like to like give a bigger, megaphone to, people who really are thought leaders, or just, small that have valuable information, ought to be thought leaders. And so that's sort of where things have evolved over the last half a year.
That's pretty crazy. So now I remember at one point you had said you owned Bitcoin through Grayscale. Was that how you first got into Bitcoin, or how did that work?
No, I first got into Bitcoin with the real thing on Coinbase and in 2017. And then when COVID came, I got back into it through Grayscale, mining stocks, whatever I could find in, my IRA accounts that I could buy. The block ETF, the LOK MicroStrategy. The block ETF is mainly Bitcoin miners and service providers. And so, I had my exposure to it, most of it indirectly, but then as time wore on, like, okay, well, it's time to, buy some of the real things. So I started building up more of the real Bitcoin, but I still own the proxies, in my retirement accounts. And so some of each. And, that's...
You didn't go, because what I did was just complete liquidation of everything. I mean, I'm in my 30s, so I'm a lot farther away from retirement, and there's a lot less of a chance that there will be, the dollar will be worth anything by the time I retire. So I just liquidated everything. But I mean, that makes sense, I think that's, one of the good things about something like Grayscale, because then there's people, you were obviously more into it, but, there's people that they're just kind of maybe like poking around at like where they can, put a little bit of their money in their retirement account. And they're like, oh, what's this? And it's like a soft introduction to Bitcoin. Is that what you see it as?
Yeah, it's a vehicle where people can more easily get into it, but not necessarily easily, right? Until the ETF became available recently. A lot of retirement accounts didn't offer Grayscale, or you had to ask special permission, and so people didn't know they could get it. But what I feel about that now is something I've been voicing on Spaces, and that is, even if the U.S. government were to like formally adopt Bitcoin as a global reserve asset, like later this decade, even in like that would like be viewed by many people as a positive news, but they would, I think, likely go to Grayscale and MicroStrategy and such and basically just buy them out. I don't use the word nationalize because I think they would, they would like give you fair market value and probably a little premium for your Bitcoin. But as soon as that was announced, then the price of Bitcoin would probably go through the roof and you'd miss up on the remaining upside. Plus, you wouldn't be self-sovereign holding the real thing. And so there's, there's real downsides and risks to owning Bitcoin through proxies. And I think it makes sense in a retirement account, but what's your allocation to the real thing versus proxies versus non-Bitcoin assets? Like I usually say that just varies with the person and their life situation. How old are they? How reliable is their income? Do they have dependents? And so that it's kind of a personal decision, I think. And I generally don't say much. I've just told you more, I think, than I've ever said about like my personal holdings of Bitcoin or my OPSEC. Like I generally just don't talk about it. Mm-hmm. And probably that's all I'd like to say.
I'm right there with you. I mean, we did all lose them in a boating accident,
right.
So like I don't own any anymore. It's a shame.
Yeah.
But I did get to go fishing that day. So, there's that. I mean, it is nice to have a soft entrance for people, but I mean, as people quickly learn, I think they realize holding the real thing is even I mean, it's just so much more important and necessary. And like I was telling Luke Mikic, and saying for us with this house buying process, I had to like prove a certain level of liquidity in Bitcoin because I was saying like, hey, they were asking for different assets, and everything that I didn't lose on the boat, I told them what I had, and so they I actually had to move some of the Bitcoin to an exchange, and it like made me sick, like sick to my stomach. So that's once you get to that, once you realize how important holding the real thing is, you'll be like, wait a minute, other than you have those proxies in your retirement account, it's like might as well ride it out. But you're gonna miss the upside if the government comes in and tries to. So let's circle back in a little bit to the government theory because I do want to pick your brain on that. So you started hosting these spaces. Like I remember in May, whenever the crash happened, I think I was on vacation or something, and Will Clemente started hosting spaces. And then I think that's how I found your spaces. Would you usually be in those and then start one up after him or something like that?
Yeah, sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I know you started your own, but I think that's how. So I came across you that way, and so you get into hosting these spaces. They're growing in size and everything. So like, what's that like on the back end? Because you guys initially started with like 50 or so, and then pretty consistently got up to like how high, like 150, 200. And like whenever you have that, I mean, how many people are requesting for people that go in there when they request, is there usually a queue of like 5 or so people that have been waiting, or is it hard to get a filled out stage?
Well, still when I open a space now, sometimes it's a little slow to get the discussion rolling. Other times it just fills up in 5 minutes, but the queue to speak doesn't usually start until after half an hour. And the longer the space goes, generally, the larger it is and the larger the queue is, unless it goes really late in the evening and then it starts shrinking in size again, or some other big space opens up like Bitcoin Magazine or something. And the audience seems to vary a lot. But yeah, certainly the average has gone up. And certainly it was like having several larger than expected spaces in the last couple of weeks that made me decide, okay, I'm gonna try doubling down on this for a couple of months, because momentum seems to keep growing, and I haven't even really been trying that hard. So what would happen if I like tried harder for a couple of months, combined that with like the Twitter Spaces Spark program, and that's the, you know, accelerator sponsored project, and just rode with it. And Bitcoin price is probably going to be rising during that same period. What would that lead to? Well, there's only one way to know. Like, give it a try.
Mm-hmm.
And like sometimes when life throws something at you, you know, you like, okay, maybe this is a sign that I really should be paying attention to this. So it was kind of just the fact that things kept growing that I'm like, okay, I'm gonna really make an effort and see what happens.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to go with the flows of different things. I think I've said this before in the podcast, and I know I've said it in your spaces before, but you know, whenever the like pro Donald Trump movie came to me, and I was like, whoa, like, okay, this is gonna be, you know, interesting. And I had always at that point stayed away from political stuff just because I don't like personally like to get wrapped up into it, and I actually really don't care much at all. Because I found that no matter who's in power, for the most part, my life until COVID happened, my life stayed the same. And you know what I mean? Like that's what, like I always like thought it was funny when people would be like Obama's in, they're like, my life's over, and I was like, I mean, I don't, my life stayed the same. And then like, you know, Bush is in, my life's over, and like, no, I mean day to day is a bit the same. But yeah, that movie came to me, and I had to think about it a lot and like ponder over it. And it's like you just sometimes life throws something at you, and you be like, you know what, let's give this a shot. And I mean, I'm a proponent of free speech, so they were getting censored, and I obviously was like, all right, I'm ready to go to bat for that. But yeah, I mean, you gotta, I recommend that to all the, you know, plebs out there, you know, like us, you know, you gotta take opportunities when they come. So you have all these spaces going, and I gotta ask, so you know, when did this clout scale start memeing? And I will preface this with, you know, I think we're all guilty of, you know, different shilling and clout chasing, even when we try not to be. Like I try really not to be, but I early on when I got in spaces, you know, just picking up cues from other podcasters and people, like, you know, I was like, oh, okay, you know, you show your stuff whenever you're on stage or whatever, you know, just politely, not over the top. And like when I did it, even then I did do it, but even then I'll admit I felt like super cringy, like, ugh, what am I doing? You know, it's like, what am I, like some radio DJ, like, check it out tonight at 7, you know, and so I just very quickly, I think I even messaged you about this. I was like, hey, sorry if I just start signing off, but like I just started going with the Irish farewell. And it was like, boom, I'm out, disappeared. And that pretty much has become the norm across spaces now.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think we're all guilty of that, you know, and like we're trying to build momentum on certain things and everything. So, you know, how did that all start as far as you're aware? Like does that go back to the Aussie space, and maybe you could shed light on that for people that don't know?
The last week in June, I kicked Aussie out of my off the stage back to listener.
What was the reason behind that?
It was the first time that I had really started a space since I got of any size, and the topic wasn't Bitcoin, you know, wasn't serious, and it was largely because of her being on stage, which she hadn't really been on my stage before much, if at all. And I was like, how can I get this onto Bitcoin? And so I'm like DMing, you know, some of the regulars to try to get them to come on stage. And finally, somebody comes on stage. This is the first time he'd come on stage, and brought the topic back to Bitcoin and Michael Saylor. And she jumped all over him, like Michael Saylor is a I don't know, bad actor. I don't remember what it was, but she was like yelling at him. And I just bumped her down to listener, and I said, we do not yell at people for switching the topic to Bitcoin. Thank God. Like somebody wants to talk about Bitcoin again. Mm-hmm. And I was like mad because I felt like she was undermining, my purpose. And so I got angry, and I shouldn't have. And people started DMing me, oh, she's such a, B word, and I'm glad you did that. And then I started like reading out those tweets without giving the name of the people who wrote them. But that was really dumb and wrong of me to do that. So she started a room or a space, log scales of Clout Chaser, and a couple dozen people went over there and I guess talked about how much they disliked me for the rest of the evening. And they bonded over that. And then those people continued to hold spaces like almost every night, talking about, in part, how much they didn't like log scale. And so, and Aussie wasn't even a part of that on an ongoing basis. She wasn't even joining those rooms for the most part. And so, I did what you're supposed to do. Well, first of all, the next morning, I apologized to everyone, that was in the space on stage, all the regulars. And I asked someone to forward it to Aussie, but she didn't want to see it. And I ignored the trolls. Like, that's what you're supposed to do, right? Ignore the trolls. They go away. But like, I ignored them for 2 months, like totally ignored them. And they didn't go away because they bonded in spaces over like their dislike of me. And so that took on this unique dynamic and a life of its own that ignoring them wasn't going to, I guess, work, right? So, this led to engagement and disengagement, and then me occasionally going over there and like trying to explain myself in tweets. And, when we pretty much now have like a truce, and it, like 80% of it was they just had made assumptions about me that weren't true, but because they told them to one another for hours on end every night, it sure seemed true to them. And so, and, in terms of clout chasing, there was nothing to shill. I was probably being like not as humble as I should have been about the success of my spaces, because I'd like tweet out like, oh my God, like, are these spaces amazing or what? And like, look who joined tonight. It's Lynn Alden. Or, and so like, I kind of started, I guess, bragging a little about the spaces, but
we're all guilty.
Honestly, half of it was I was just expressing surprise and delight about like how great they were going, right? So, but one of the things I learned through that is like, as your account size grows, the expectations change about like how you should behave, especially, in the Bitcoin space. And so I've like tried to like ratchet back what I'm saying and realize that, okay, I guess there's people see that I have more of a responsibility. I need to think about that. And ultimately, like, let's just divorce log scale from this account and put log scale back on a brand new account that can be my personal voice, and have the hosting account be just more of a neutral platform, like a radio station or something, an interactive radio station. And so, that's, but I think I'd be arriving at that point, even if none of this controversy had happened, because that's just sort of a natural progression of things, especially when I'm not seeking to be a voice myself. This is the first time I've done a podcast, and maybe the last.
You're going to get hounded a lot, but we can put that out there now for people that, this was just kind of we had a personal conversation, you and I, and you were like, let's sit down and just kind of have this out there for people. So you might, if Log doesn't want to do more, he doesn't want to do more, Right.
Yes. I reserve the right not to do any more podcasts.
So it just kind of, it is that, because sometimes like I'll get really excited about things and it can come off. I totally understand where it comes off as like you're like bragging about something, you know what I mean? And it's just like oh my god, like we this that the other thing. Even like in personal conversation, just one on one, when I was talking to Luke about like where we're moving to and like how excited I was about the house and everything. I was like, I'm not like trying to brag, like I just but I just, that's the way I'm, like I get excited about something and I just blah, it comes out.
Right.
So that and it's funny, I think, I don't know if you saw the recent Joe Rogan episode, but he had the guy from The Social Dilemma on. They were talking about the feedback loop of social media. So I wanted to pick on that for a second because something you said where they made assumptions about you that weren't true, but they, it gets into that feedback loop and it gets cemented as reality. And obviously, since then you've have a truce with them and everybody's come to an understanding. I think that's kind of an interesting view on how social media works, where things get circulated and can become truth in people's minds. It's kind of interesting.
So
And it kind of happened to you on a personal level.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because I'm like a middle age. I never got on social media. I mean, I was still like, mid 30s when Facebook became popular, but I was like, I've always been a very private person. Like, why would I want to put my life on display? I'm not going to do that. So I just never got on social media. And so I have never had any experience with it. And I don't have kids, so I don't know what, it's like to encounter trolls on social media. And so like, I was just like kind of going into this, like,
basically completely
naive person and
a completely green social
right.
media person.
Yes. And then all this shit happens and I wasn't prepared for it because I didn't even have a context, for it. So, but again, it's part of the story. None of this was planned. This just kept growing organically. And here we are.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit because you've said before you're in your 50s, right? Yeah, you're not, yeah, but so that's what I tried to, whenever I was, because I kind of was like so thrown off by the whole situation, and in my mind I was like, just trying to imagine, I'm 35, so like, someone 15 years my senior, what would the experience of coming to social media like brand new be like? And it would be like a completely different world, because like my brother, who's 4 years older than me, I mean, just that 4 year difference, because he graduated college in '04, and that's when I graduated high school. And like right whenever I graduated high school, went into college, like Facebook, MySpace, everything took off. And there's just like this disconnect, even in that 4 year gap, where like we joke because like him and my sister-in-law still have like a joint Facebook account. Like I don't even have a Facebook account at this point, but it's like we're always like, oh, like which one of them was the one that posted that, and it's like you're a boomer if you have a joint Facebook account with your spouse or whatever. But like, so even in that 4 years, there's a huge gap in understanding of what social media is. So for someone like yourself, like, did you just start up a Twitter account just to kind of follow like Bitcoin news and read up on it?
Well, financial news in general, the markets, macro, and then that Bitcoin quickly became a part of that. So yeah, it was just like, I was just a person with like, a few dozen followers and collecting information.
And what made you go with the name Log Scale?
For the first week of Spaces, my avatar was Log Scale, and my like display name was X Bitcoin skeptic, because I was like on these, I was chatting with finance people outside of Bitcoin and asking them questions. Like I kind of wanted to provoke the discussion and like, you guys should be getting into Bitcoin. So I kind of said, I'm an ex-skeptic, you're a skeptic, maybe you should take a look at Bitcoin. But like when Spaces started, like people like, well, what are we supposed to call you? X? Like, okay, I'll just change the display name to Log Scale. But, Log Scale came from just the idea, like if you look at Bitcoin on a linear scale, it looks like crazy. It looks like tulips, it looks like mania that's going to crash. If you look at it on log scale, you see like, oh, this is just a naturally progressing exponential path. It's almost kind of predictable. And, and so I changed my background image to the stock to flow model with the colored dots. And I created a log scale avatar to try to like get people like, hey, you should be looking at Bitcoin this way, not on linear scale. So that happened, sometime early in the year. And then the, Spaces came and I learned a lot more about Bitcoin, but I kept the name, kind of liked it. And then once in a while, everybody knew me as Log Scale. I'm like, okay, well, I guess that's just who I am now.
Yeah, that has become your persona. Is it weird that just like on a regular basis you hear people calling you Log?
No, like, actually, I've gotten used to it. It's kind of normal now.
Oh, it's so funny because for the longest time, my Twitter account was just literally Bitcoin Made Simple. So people would refer to me that way, or they'd say BMS on Spaces. And then when I switched it over, they started saying my name, but I wouldn't react. Sometimes I wouldn't react. Like, I don't know if Corey Clipston was in this space, then I'd be like just sitting there like they're off, or if he was like, if for some reason that I just wasn't used to my name being used, so it just kind of threw me off there for a little bit. So I mean, I don't like, what was that like, because that's difficult to deal with, the bullying, all that kind of stuff. And it's something that, can get out of hand quickly. And, everyone who likes to act like they're above it, we all do it to a degree. You know what I mean? Like, it's just easy to laugh at other people and all that kind of stuff. So what was it like? I mean, like, was it just mentally too tasking for you at that point? Like, whenever you said like, look, I'm done. Like, I'm walking away from this.
Yeah, there was that point in September where I'm like, this isn't worth it. I'm not having fun. I don't need to be doing this. And I'm out of here. And I actually spent like half a week thinking I really wasn't coming back. I remember like I had my first phone call with Dennis Porter over that weekend, and I told him, I'm not coming back, dude. I'm done. I'm out of here. You can deal with those people. And then, the days ticked by, and I like, okay, maybe I'll come back. And I had my tweets protected, and I ended up leaving them protected for a couple of weeks. And then I'm like plotting my return, okay, well, if I'm going to return, how am I going to do this? And so I came back and started hosting Spaces again. First, just 1 or 2 a week, and then gradually ramped back up. And like now I'm like pretty much hosting them every day again. So, but I think the difference is that like it was like shocking to me, especially because a lot of it seemed unfair. Like the criticisms against me were the same criticisms that would apply to big names with like 250,000 followers, but they'd never criticize those people, just me, right? So I'd be like, it seemed unjust. And but when I got to the point where like that I have no emotions about it anymore, and I don't think I would have come back if I hadn't gotten to that point, because I I don't really have time for other people to be like impacting my life emotionally, but it doesn't bother me now. Like now it's just funny, or, I just like, oh, there they go again. But it doesn't affect me. And it was in September, like affecting me, So I guess it's just
Yeah,
natural.
no, that's what I figured what was going on, because that's, like I said, you were, just like a private business owner, like preferred to not be in the public eye, and you kind of got thrust into it, even though, I mean, once you got it going, you're like, hey, this is fun, let's keep it going. So in a way, you're growing it yourself. But yeah, like I said before, with the Trump movie, like at that point, I made the conscious decision. I was like, okay, like I'm opening myself up to criticism. Like I really enjoyed up to that point, just like operating like companies in the movie business, laying low. You know what I mean? Like people in the business knew who I was. Like we would, at meetings or whatever, they knew me at conferences, all that kind of stuff. But like my name was like never in an article, nothing like that. And so I made that conscious decision, but it took a lot of mental coaching to get there, and I had to think about it for a long time, and I had been thinking about it ahead of time, where it's hard because you just have to get numb to it. And ultimately too, I think the lesson for younger, like people that are having like younger kids, like I actually took it as a way to because really, who would want to take that on? You know what I mean? Like having yourself open to criticism and people saying stuff about you, your ears burning, all that kind of stuff. Um, but I was like, I'm afraid of my kids getting older and having to experience social media.
Mm,
Um, because like one of the things that you don't think about is that like back in our day, if there was bullying at school, and like, I'm lucky that I wasn't, bullied or anything, and actually probably, like guilty of bullying, not being like mean, but, you know, like I said, and we're not immune to it. Like we all, everybody laughs and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not a perfect person, but the, you know, back then when the bullying stopped at 3 o'clock, the school day was over, it was done. And nowadays, what terrifies me for kids is that the bullying is consistent. It goes all day. It's on the internet. Um, and so that's what I'm really afraid of for my kids and just for kids in general. Um, because you had that safe haven back in the day. You went home.
right.
Home was the safe place. And now it's like I can't imagine the torture of somebody who's getting bullied. So that's actually one of the reasons why I was like, I'm going to confront this head on, um, and hopefully be able to pass something on to my kids. But I mean, do you notice that with like social media, of like, you know, back in the day, if you got bullied at school, at least you went home and it shut off. But now it's like you have people like in your face about it all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine. It's got to be hard to be a kid or raise kids these days. Um, it's like you know, it's a significant change in human history, like human evolution, about how we interact with one another. Um, and I guess you could say that's true of most things digital, including Bitcoin. Um, and a lot of people aren't equipped to deal with change, and a lot of people are afraid of change, and that just makes it all of this, whether it's social media or politics or anything, like more complicated, and stressful, for some people. But yeah, I now have a context for social media I didn't have before.
Yeah, it's the ups and downs, and that's you have to get to the point. There's this comedian from Pittsburgh, Billy Gardell, um, that he's on that show now. It's called Bob Hart's Abishola, and he was in that show Mike and Molly. I don't know if you remember that. Um, and so he's a bigger guy, and he said he was like, I told my son, because his son I think is like 18 now or something. He's like, you got to get to the point where you look in the mirror and you realize that nobody else's opinion matters except for that person's right there. And he's like, my son was like, well, Dad, but you're a movie star, like you're in TV shows, of course, and he was like, go on and search my name. And so he, like, son Googled his name, and he's like showing him, he's like, well, Dad, this person, oh, Billy, you're great in this, you're great in that. He's like, and then you get to the, one point in like the message board or comments on something where somebody's like, you fat F, you suck in this movie and you suck in this show and everything like that. And then like you start to see it more and more and more, and that feed it starts feeding it to you. And his son, like, his son was like, oh, like, what do you do? And he's like, you know what I do? I shut the computer and go to sleep in this big freaking house. It's like you have to look at like what you're doing. Like it has to be, like you could sit there and look at like, oh, I'm not a success whenever he's on syndicated TV shows and like as a star, like, no, actually I'm doing all right. So yeah, it's interesting. And yeah, it's something that weighs on me with kids, because it's just, that there's multiple realities that come into existence. People believe something and they follow it up. And I mean, it was even funny. Like I had hopped in that one space that was talking about Jack Dorsey this morning, whereas hearing people talk about different things and just seeing how their point of view on a subject is completely different from the actual reality, and then the reality that I see and the reality that people on the other side see. You know what I mean? Like it's just it's this real weird conundrum that we have, and it's interesting that you were actually a person that got swept up into that. So enough about that. And by the way, I like shout out to Matt, that you and Matt went in that space and had it out, and I think that was very fair on all fronts, and I was just tipping my cap to both of you guys for doing that in a mature and open way.
The one this morning?
No, Matt,
Oh.
with like a couple weeks ago or whatever, 3 weeks ago.
Oh yeah.
Whenever you were like, he was basically like your prosecutor.
Yeah.
Because also, I mean, I think we, I don't want to rehash all that, but it's like you were like, look, I made some mistakes, and like I think we need to get to that point where people can make mistakes again in life and not be, erased from history. Because
right.
Jesus Christ, like, I mean, they would dig up like 15-year-old emails of anybody. They're not going to be pleasant. I remember having this conversation with a friend of mine in 2011. We were like, I can't believe all the stuff people are putting on social media. Like, they're never going to be able to run for president. And then like 5 years later, Trump's on Twitter, and you're like, well, never mind. I guess like doesn't
Right.
matter what you put on social media.
Right.
But it was just, I still think that stuff can be harmful for people. Like it gets tracked back to you, and 15 years from now, somebody's going to dig it up and cancel you. And so anyways, just get to the point where you're uncancelable. So back to the Bitcoin related stuff. I'm going to pull on the thread of your theory of, give people the premise if they don't know it, just a quick overview of your theory of what the US government might be doing with Bitcoin and how they might be trying to adopt it.
So we had discussed in my spaces the possibility that the US government might want to formally embrace Bitcoin one day. And we talked about the game theory of that and the Triffin dilemma. Lynn Alden had written a piece. Basically, the Triffin dilemma says if you're the world reserve currency, that works out really well for your country for a number of decades. And then, after a century or so, it starts working against you and you end up with a lot of debt. Your manufacturing has all been offshored. And that's why most world reserve currencies only lasted about a century. And so that, at some point you might want to pass on the world reserve currency to someone else, but we don't want to pass it on to China. And like, well, now there's a possibility to pass it on to Bitcoin. So like it actually could be in the interest of the US government to decide to go that route. And that's not the only reason the US government might want to actually embrace Bitcoin someday. So this had been discussed as a theory, but it was just like, one of those fun game theory things you talk about and think about. It wasn't real. And then Gary Gensler on August 3rd gave his first extended remarks on cryptocurrencies at the Aspen Institute, and I watched it live. I was actually kind of live blogging it.
Oh yeah, didn't you do a space or something?
No, this was an earlier speech of his, I think. Yeah, well, I don't know if I had a space going or not. Anyway, but I was like watching him, like, holy shit! Like, this guy loves Toshi, loves Bitcoin. He understands them. He taught them, but he does not like altcoins, like kind of users of unregistered securities. And I'm like, I sent out this tweet at the end of the speech: Gary Gensler, Bitcoin maximalist. I started a space with that title at the end of the speech, actually. And then, like, a lot of stuff happened that week. It's the same week the infrastructure bill was released. The CFTC commissioner made a statement. Elizabeth Warren walked back some comments on Bitcoin. 2 amendments to the infrastructure bill were made. They were both bipartisan, like equal number of Democrats and Republicans.
Didn't they both get rejected?
Yes and no. That's a separate topic. And I'm like, oh, and the White House endorsed the proof of work amendment at the expense of proof of stake, at least for a day or two when they endorsed it, it was. And I'm like, how do you explain all this happening and that Gary Gensler being hired in the first place if at some level the government wasn't wanting to at least protect Bitcoin as a plan B down the road? And so I speculated about that. And this stuff went viral, and then somebody contacted me who still wishes to remain anonymous and said, I've been doing a lot of research on this topic. Why don't you tweet this stuff? And then started feeding me information. Not all of which, by the way, I have gone public with yet, but I will soon. And but I published a lot of it. And then this researcher and I recently have dug up more ourselves. And what we found is that there is a pattern of Bitcoin experts moving like in a kind of a hiring revolving door between the White House and MIT and Princeton, and there's a lot of connections, okay? And so I know that there are people in government who are on like both sides of the Bitcoin question or neutral, but there are people in the government, who understand Bitcoin and who have gone through its game theory, and they've been thinking about this since 2014. And so there are people who get it in the government. And I think the evidence to explain like the events of August, for example, is there are people in the government holding sway saying, hey, you cannot close the door on Bitcoin. We may need it. And, or our citizens may need it. And that's why like there's been this kind of protected status for Bitcoin. And regarding the amendment, they ran out of time. There ended up being 8 senators who tried to get this fixed, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans. They ran out of time. And so all that was left was like a unanimous, like a voice vote type deal. And they needed 100 senators to pass the fix. So the 2 amendments got merged. They worked together. These 8 senators worked out a fix. And they got to this voice vote, and they got 99 out of 100 senators to vote for the fix. And the one that objected was Richard Selby from Alabama. And afterwards, he's like, well, I supported fixing that language, but I rejected it because they rejected my other amendment on military spending. So out of spite, like he voted against it. But that means there's 99 and actually 100 senators supporting fixing the bill. And now it's going to get fixed in the House. And meanwhile, after the bill was passed, Janet Yellen's Treasury Department, IRS, leaked to the press, we're not going to enforce that restrictive broker language. Don't worry about it. I'm like, and now you've got like the FDIC, like working with banks to allow them to custody Bitcoin. And I'm like, none of that would be happening if the government really was interested in shutting down Bitcoin. So there's a lot to say, but that's a brief overview.
Now, I think that the government would like to shut down Bitcoin, but I think they've realized that they can't.
That may be part of it.
And so they're like, all right, we have to figure out how we're going to make this work for us. That's my, I guess, really skeptical take on it.
Yes, and right, the fact that Bitcoin is resistant to government control may end up having mattered, even though like the big war was never fought, if the big war is never fought, because they realized too late they were already defeated. And so Bitcoin's government resistance still worked without even having to go to war.
Go through the, I mean, because, Bitcoin doesn't need any governments to adopt it. Governments need to adopt it, though.
Yes.
And, I think more and more, like obviously El Salvador, Tonga is talking about it. So it's going to start with those small countries with, that solves the remittance problem for them. But I think, what do you think? Do you think it just keeps growing in that direction? And because they're going to figure it out of necessity. They're like, we need to do this. We're, bleeding money through to our people are bleeding money to the remittances and all the fees. And then they're being dependent on the US dollar. And, like something like Jack Mallers said, where, all those stimulus checks went out, but none of them came to El Salvador, but that country's still dependent on the dollar. So, it would be I think quite a leap forward and very forward thinking for the government to, because if the US wants to retain this position, which I would imagine they do, it would make sense to start embracing Bitcoin and figure out how it can be a part of the future, and how they can incorporate it into their game plan. I hope that doesn't lead to something like a 6102 like they did with gold, and they try to confiscate it from everybody and say, we'll hold it at the Federal Reserve, trust us. I don't know.
It's could play out a lot of different ways, and nobody knows for sure. But I never get tired of speculating about how it might play out.
Yeah, it's an interesting, because I do believe that, Satoshi did create something here that leads to a potential peaceful revolution. But I also, at the same time, you've heard me say many times, I'm like, the people that were in control of they had a monopoly on information, they had a monopoly on money, and we think that they're just going to willingly give that up, like, and not, go out kicking and screaming. And it might not even be the politicians, it's just whoever, donors, things like that, people higher up and stuff like that pull these strings, because this works this is a fair system, and I'm hoping that the US is the pioneer here, because that's what we're founded on. That's what our ancestors were pioneers, and taking a chance on something and wanting a fair system. They didn't mind paying their taxes as long as it was for their voice was heard. That's what started the revolution. So I don't know. What do you think is the most likely outcome? Because there's multiple ways this goes, but what do you see being the most likely?
I'm inclined to believe in a theory similar to the dollar milkshake theory, where the other fiat currencies of the world fail before the dollar. They're weaker than the dollar. Obviously, they're not the world reserve currency. They're mostly debasing at a higher rate, faster rate than we are. And so I think that there'll be some time to watch. And some of them are already failing, right? Some of them already failed. So you're going to see these currencies fail, and then these countries are going to basically end up choosing between the dollar or Bitcoin or both, which sets up a grand battle in the end between the dollar and Bitcoin. But during that process, the dollar may get stronger, certainly against other currencies of the world, but it will also probably continue to lose buying power as it's debased. But and then they have to keep printing money. But the dollar standing in the world relative to other currencies will strengthen even as the dollar gets weaker. And then the final battle is between the dollar and Bitcoin. I think that's the most likely way that it plays out. But, you know, these things can like play out that way for like half of that. And then it all changes. And like Bitcoin goes vertical because, you know, the countries of the world realizing they're all basically secretly trying to front one another into Bitcoin. And then it just becomes like a massive pile-in. And I think that could be very like chaotic for everyone, except maybe people with Bitcoin and cold storage. And the governments then may try to slow it down. So if like they try to shut off and on ramps or do a 61 or 2 or something, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are trying to kill Bitcoin, and they probably know that they can't, but that the social unrest of a massive remonetization from the dollar to Bitcoin happening so fast will like destabilize the society and the world. And so they're okay with it happening, but they'd rather slow it down. And I think it's probably in the best interest of everyone if this just happens more gradually, like over the course of this decade. But it's easy to see it reaching that tipping point where gradual doesn't work, and it just goes vertical. And then I think governments may act, but again, I think there will likely be trying to smooth it out rather than shut it down.
Yep. I mean, that's what, you know, I've recommended many times to people, you know, get out of cities, get yourself some space. You know, just with, I mean, outside of that, but like with, you know, COVID and the lockdowns, and then, you know, rolling into now this supply chain issue, you know, and everything. And it's like, you know, your neighbor doesn't become violent until they can't feed their family. And it's not saying you shouldn't trust other people. It's just, you got to really find a way to weather the storm here, you know, on an individual level. Because yeah, it would be in an ideal world, Bitcoin, you know, it flips into a Bitcoin standard without anything going awry. And, you know, you just wake up all of a sudden and gas is priced in Bitcoin, and, you know, it's like, oh, okay, this works. But yeah, I think people need to prepare for the worst, hope for the best. Because it could be an interesting decade.
It's definitely going to be an interesting decade. And we're at the front row of history unfolding, and most people don't even know. I mean, I think most people know things are not normal, and not sure when they will be normal or what normal will look like. But I don't think most people understand how dramatic the changes may be this decade, especially if you don't understand, you know, the natural cycle of things, and that at the end of a massive debt cycle, there's naturally social unrest, political unrest, economic, unrest, and that this is just a normal course of events. What's different is that there was never something like Bitcoin entering the chat, as we say, and that's going to make, I think, for absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm already glued to it every day, and it's barely begun.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. One last thing I wanted to touch on, because I don't think we talked about the specifics, but so was it the thing that caused the rift? Was that a lot of? I mean, I know there was the initial thing, but do you think you caught a lot of the flack for people not being receptive to the whole conversation of like mining stocks, like investing in Bitcoin mining stocks and everything? Because to be honest, like for people that are newer to the space, I think that's where, like, I mean, there's many places. I think that the Bitcoin toxic maximalism is very healthy. And I think you did a good job of navigating that and like realizing like, hey, like, okay, like because I think it was Matt that was saying it, but I've heard it from multiple people. They're like, people have come into these spaces before and have, been the snake oil salesman, like, and try to lure your fiat away from Bitcoin. And so, I mean, do you think that is what a lot of the flack was for? And do you think, have you gained a perspective that you maybe didn't have before of like an awareness to, potential, I don't want to say scams, just to flatly call everything a scam, but like, let's say things that will take your fiat away from owning Bitcoin yourself?
Definitely more aware of it. The controversy started long before the mining stocks became an issue. It was there was some, alleged clout chasing because I removed somebody from speaker spot, but also the issues that what came on the heels of that was, you're giving Lord Fusitua of Tonga a platform, and you're like supporting Erica Rhodes, who's running against Brad Sherman, the only like vociferously anti-Bitcoin member of Congress, and she's trying to primary him, Democrat versus Democrat. And in Tonga, they had a vaccine mandate, and so he's a communist and she's a communist and I'm a communist for supporting both of them. And that's what the main issue was for many, many weeks before
the mining stocks entered
the picture. And my response to that is, you don't have a really good understanding of game theory for a Bitcoiner if you're leveling those criticisms. Because, Bitcoin is for enemies, but you would rather have Bitcoin co-opt your enemies rather than have your enemies fully realize what Bitcoin is. Until your enemies' incentives have unwittingly to them all of a sudden become aligned with yours. Right. And so, and I believe that one of the most effective attacks against Bitcoin would be a social political attack where it was turned into a left-right issue.
Mm-hmm.
And why would you want to rile up 50% of the population to oppose Bitcoin? The 50-50 left-right wars have not been won successfully by either side, arguably, because they're 50-50. And so why would you want to risk turning Bitcoin into something like that? Ultimately, Bitcoin would win, but could it set the course of that back for years? It possibly could. And so I'm like, I'm like pretty centrist politically, and I understand there are things about Bitcoin that really appeal to progressives. Fairness, everybody playing by the same rules. They were upset about the Cantillon effect before anybody knew what it was, right? Including now. And so there's plenty of reasons that people on the left can find that Bitcoin solves major problems they see in the world. And most people hold their political views because of problems they see in the world. The political view didn't come first. The state of the world and how they see it comes first. And Bitcoin can change that for them. And so it really does change people's philosophical and political outlooks. And so why put up these old roadblocks in the way? And I say to like libertarians who believe that like Bitcoin will ultimately defund the state. I don't actually agree with that. But if that's your position, wouldn't you want to like, wouldn't you want to be stealthy about it? Wouldn't you want statists to be buying into it right now? And so I'm like, the game theory, the smart game theory way to go is, military terms like conduct a feint or a Trojan horse, really. And then you've got like these left curvers that are like right wing, left curve on the IQ spectrum. Like, they're like people from your army running over the hill, telling the enemy what you're up to. I'm like, what the like, if you think Bitcoin is going to defund the state, why would you be broadcasting that to the state? Why would you be trying to turn it into a political issue? So I think that some people are just still too trapped in the old way of thinking, and they haven't fully understood the power of Bitcoin, like on a game theory standpoint.
I would think that none of us understand it.
Well, that's true, right? And we won't really know until history plays itself out.
Yeah, because I keep saying that, like, Bitcoin, like I got to 1% of understanding it, and I think everyone remains at 1% forever because it just gets deeper, and yeah.
But just to back up 1 second, I just have to say this with the Lord Fusitua and the Erica Rhodes thing, like most of the biggest names in Bitcoin were behind those, like, let's just say those two, whether it's Alex Gladstein or Preston Pish, or, you name it, Jimmy Song, and nobody was criticizing them for it. It was just me, right? So that's part of why it was hard to take this as constructive criticism, especially, it was laced with profanities and obscenities. But when, we were able to like actually get into a space together for hours on a number of days and talk it through, it's like, okay, well, really, we're pretty much coming from the same place here. There's just a lot of misunderstandings. And when criticism is constructive, as it did become in some of the spaces we held together, then I'm open to it and I'll adjust. And I did. Like the first time we got into it, I did make some adjustments, and then a month passed and I was like still getting criticized for the same stuff. And so like kind of the follow-up space was, hey guys, didn't you realize like I made changes since a month ago? And they're like, they hadn't noticed, right? And like, oh, good for you, So I'm still learning, and I always will be.
Yeah, and I think that that's important for everybody to remember, because I just from the get-go, I was like, in my mind, I was like, this, like let's just say the mining stock play, I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. This would be the worst thing you could do with your money, like not the worst. I guess the worst would be, lighting it on fire.
Well, okay, that reminds me of the topic. So when Spaces started and Bitcoiners really started talking, and it was May, and it was June, and it was July. Like the standard advice that pretty much everyone shared that were like Bitcoiners was your percentage allocation to Bitcoin ought to be in line with your conviction level, and it ought to be money that you don't need for at least 4 years, if not 8 or 10, for your emergency stash or whatever. That was like standard advice. And it was on the heels of a like 55 or whatever it was percent correction in the price of Bitcoin. But like this fall, somehow a lot of like Bitcoiners got on the idea that to be a real Bitcoiner or a Bitcoin maximalist, you needed to have all of your liquid assets in Bitcoin. That was not a common position in the summer. So there was a change, and I ran a poll on, hey, Bitcoin maximalist, what do you think Bitcoin maximalism means? And I gave a number of different options, and the results were split. About 35% of people thought it meant having all your liquid assets in Bitcoin, but the rest of them did not. And so there isn't even agreement among this like Bitcoin Twitter maximalist crowd as to like what a Bitcoin maximalist means in terms of your portfolio. And so, I think that how much you have in traditional assets would depend on your position in life and some of the factors we mentioned before. To me, though, it's like if you're in Bitcoin mining stocks, they're so correlated to Bitcoin. That's not diversification, right? And so where I've come down in terms of, okay, well, of what I don't have in Bitcoin, what's it in? And I've come to the unlikely conclusion that it's USD. Because if we have a major crash of all markets, Bitcoin will go down with them. And just holding pure USD will be the best thing that you can have. And then you can buy Bitcoin on the cheap. So why would I want to hold Bitcoin, say, and stocks? Because if everything crashes, they'll crash together. I'd rather have dollars in that case. And yes, they're being debased at probably more than 10% a year. But the Bitcoin part of the portfolio is like, increasing in buying power by over 100% a year. So that's pretty damn good protection against the fiat that you hold. And then if things go really bad and everything goes really bad, I want money to buy Bitcoin when it's down. So to me, it's just BTC and USD, and that's the portfolio. And then the allocation depends on, your conviction level and your circumstances in life.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like all in, and to the point where like if I just have an extra expense, if my kids want like an extra, like, they want an extra toy, I'm like, oh crap, I gotta sell some Bitcoin to buy the. I can't. So I did come up with this theory, this plan where if you're willing to buy something very fiat-y, if that's a term, you have to be willing to match that price, the amount of money you spend on it, and buy yourself some Bitcoin to set aside. Right. So it's like if you're gonna buy some $20 piece of junk, and it's gonna be like you're like, why am I buying this? But you wanted to, like, you can still do it if you put another 20 in Bitcoin.
And the presumption behind what I'm saying, if you want to allocate some USD and some Bitcoin, is that there's a non-zero chance that there could be some catastrophic event for Bitcoin. We think that's extremely low, but it could happen. Like you buy insurance because your house might burn down. That's also an extremely low likelihood.
Oh yeah, I mean, you need that runway of like if everything collapses, but people will still take that crummy dollar. It's like you still need like enough money. Like let's just say, like I'm making literally a fantasy scenario, but like if you're stuck in a war zone, or you're stuck somewhere that's like dangerous and you need to get out, in the case that the place becomes that dangerous place, or the place you need to leave, you need to have enough of the local currency to get yourself to the border and get in a boat and get to the other, to the safe land,
And
to the high ground.
yeah, and on this non-zero chance of some catastrophic event for Bitcoin, when I was doing, research into the U.S. government and Bitcoin, and to these personnel that have kind of been through the revolving door, I found an interview with one of them who's a Bitcoin developer, and Bitcoin Core developer, who said, those of us like core devs, in our own like chat groups, I think they're on IRC or anyway, we aren't, I can't remember what the wording was, but basically we don't have the same 100% confidence that a lot of these Bitcoin maximalists on Twitter have. Like the people actually writing the code, they worry about it. And
living it, man.
Right. And probably scaling stuff, they're concerned about, and potential attacks. And, but I was like, we might be in a little bit of an echo chamber, thinking Bitcoin's 100% likely to succeed. We should have 100% of our dollars in it. Maybe there should be a little bit of a risk to reward calculation for the same reason we buy insurance for an unlikely catastrophe,
in
right?
The unlikely event that, it's interesting. I think, I completely support the toxic maximalism from, because it saves people from investing in dangerous things. If it wasn't for them, I probably would have had come in with this, portfolio when I initially came in. I probably would have had all kinds of shit coins mixed in, and more susceptible to scams. And but instead I literally had, I bought one ETH, and then one whole ETH, and then everything else was Bitcoin.
By the way,
and and then I quickly sold that because the maxis were like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh,
what are you doing?" On that topic, so when it all kind of came to a head in September, there was a 48-hour period where I was waging a war against toxic maximalism, because
you were just going for it.
I believe that that's what was motivating a few dozen trolls to just go after me relentlessly. They were upholding their behavior under the banner of toxicity. But I've never shilled anything other than Bitcoin, and so they weren't using toxicity in the way that it was intended. And somebody who really helped kind of get me through that period was Tomer Strolight, and he wrote the article on toxicity, and we had gotten to know one another over the phone when Swan Private Client Newsletter published my piece on Bitcoin. He was the editor, and so when I returned, I put out a thread saying some thoughts on toxicity, which is still out there. But I left my tweets locked so that people couldn't forward it, because I didn't want to reignite this war.
So you just wanted the words out there.
I just wanted to be on the record. And basically, I'm like, okay, I get where toxicity has been useful to Bitcoin. I understand the fork wars, understand the purpose of it, and this is what it is. But just being an asshole because you're a Bitcoiner, that's not what toxicity is. And that's not what it's for. And so I just put it out on the record. This is the right kind of toxicity. This is the wrong kind of toxicity. And it's still out there. And then I unlocked my tweets, and somebody could pull it up and forward it today. But it's an old tweet. And It's just, those are my thoughts. They're out there, but I don't want to get into it again. Like,
Yeah.
I do not want to
Not
get
looking
into
to
it
do
again.
that again.
And I
Well,
don't want to talk about like Bitcoiners and their mentalities. And I was falling into the trap of doing that even a little bit after I returned. And like, let's just talk about Bitcoin,
yeah.
and not talk
Well,
about Bitcoiners.
and I've told people before, the best way, so like Bitcoin wins, it wins all the arguments. Um, and the best way to win arguments is to identify the weaknesses in your opponent's views and just lean on them. Like they're almost like they're like wounds, you know what I mean? Like just lean on it and put pressure on it because they can't defend it. And that's one of the things I love with the Bitcoin toxic maxis is like there have been times I've been in spaces, maybe some of them were yours, where like, somebody comes on the stage that is not all Bitcoin. And, the moment they say the word crypto, or like you can just feel it coming, and they like ask a question like, well, why wouldn't you want to do more than Bitcoin? Blah, 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 and like it's like everybody unmutes their mic and is like, blah, 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 and it's just like, and then we have to tone it down and go one by one. But like it's just boom, concise, like everybody has the concise argument. And it's really easy to shoot down, like, because Bitcoin wins, Bitcoin's truth. Everything else has weaknesses, and we know that at this point. So yeah, I enjoy that part. Like whenever somebody starts bringing up, I'm like, oh man, you were going into a buzzsaw. Like you can't win this one. Whereas on the other hand, like I know like Luke and there's other people will go into like ETH rooms and just like fight it out with them, and it's like it's amazing because whenever you have the winning answer, it's much easier to argue. Instead
Yeah.
of trying to defend all these booger pickers, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, and one of the reasons why I like wanted to launch this regular Q&A series, one for newbies and one for altcoiners, is instead of just like booting them off the stage or whatever, like why don't we just tell them, hey, this isn't the right time for us to deal with your altcoin issues, but we have a space once a week and now 3 times a week where you can we invite you to come up and raise these topics. So here's the schedule and just come then. And I'm like, we can tell other people who host Bitcoin spaces the same thing. Hey, you don't have to just boot them off the stage, say, hey, go check out this schedule. Go ask your questions over there.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that way,
time and a place.
Time and a place, exactly.
Well, Log, is there anything else you want to get out there in the air? I'll let we'll talk about what you're setting up and everything. But anything else to clear the air that you want to get out there? You
did a pretty good job of getting us around all the bases, I have to say.
There's a lot to cover. And it was if we missed anything, apologies to everyone out there, but I tried to cover it all. And so talk a little bit about just to hand people off, because you'll be rebranding and you'll be doing you're basically turning your channel into, or your Twitter handle into a radio station.
Yeah, basically an interactive radio station. Yes. And, as a part of that, doing more spaces, inviting people on to play more of a role from a co-host slot, inviting a number of podcasts on, including your own, and filling up more content so that, when newbies come and Twitter says they're going to be promoting spaces in general a lot more now that they got the bugs out. So they're saying, expect a lot more people coming, expect a lot more people, especially if we're sponsoring you. And the Bitcoin price goes up, that's going to pull in a ton of new people. And so I'm like, I'd rather when new people stumble across spaces, we can kind of be a fairly constant presence where there's a high signal to noise ratio that draws them in and makes them want to stay and learn more. And so that's kind of my goal. And there's going to be a lot of different Bitcoin spaces running at the same time, because there's going to be a lot more than a dozen people who want to be speaking at the same time. and that's fine. And a lot of people just want to hang out with other Bitcoiners and, hang out with their buddies and bullshit. That's fine too. But there
those
should
spaces
be
are
a
fun
space,
too. Yeah.
yeah, but that doesn't really help a newbie, right? So there should be a space running most of the time where someone can just drop in and start thinking like, wow, this is really interesting. I got to listen to more of this. And then they just start going down the rabbit hole. And so that's the point of like broadening this into more content and more hours. And, what Twitter pays for this is like $2,500 a month and $500 in advertising credit. So you can't like live on that. And this is, I'm still doing all of this, taking a lot of my time that should probably be going into my business, right? I've given up a lot of potential money I could have made, but I've learned a lot and I really enjoy this. And if this does go, like it might, then I'd look at, private sponsorships. I don't even know what the landscape for that is like. So it's like, well, let's just build this up and see where it goes. And maybe there's enough money in sponsorships to support a number of people, that are helping making this happen. So, but I got no idea. I got to just try it and find out what happens.
Mm-hmm.
But thankfully there's like a dozen Bitcoin only companies. And so there's plenty of sponsorship money. I would not even feel comfortable like taking a BlockFi or a Celsius or those kinds of, platforms that
any of the casinos,
the other influencers, have as sponsors, because I don't believe that you should lend out your Bitcoin, borrowing against it under the right circumstances. That's a different thing. But, there's plenty of like good, solid Bitcoin only companies doing good things that might be interested in sponsoring this. And if so, great. If not, I'll probably like wind it down or break it apart and like let other people, like take over. But who knows? Like I couldn't have told you a month ago that I'd be where I am now. I couldn't have told you 2 months ago I would have been. So like I'm just rolling with it and trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, hey, everybody check it out. And your Twitter handle is _law, or what are the two Twitter handles that they should follow?
Let's put that in the text when you release the podcast.
Okay. That way it'll be easier for people to.
Yeah, and that way we'll make sure it's correct. I mean, I think I'm like 95% sure, and there's a mock-up and everything. But now, because like Twitter's working with me in like some sort of official capacity, I have to like a significant change run by them, and I'm waiting to hear back. So
yeah,
I'd rather not announce something that turns out to be not the case.
Well, if you follow anybody on Twitter, you'll most likely see them at one point or another, if they're in Bitcoin, in a log scale space. So, Log, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing where this interactive radio station goes. Yeah, and I'm like want to thank you for talking me into doing this podcast. I actually really enjoyed it, and I'm glad I did it. I still may not do another one. But it was good to like do this once and put some stuff off your chest. Yeah, and it made a lot of sense. And I'm really like happy that that you and Luke are interested in working with your podcast from the platform, to be able to get some interactive Q&A to your guests that way. And it'll be interesting just to see how this goes. But Twitter is committed to making spaces a major thing. So I think we need to run with it and see where that takes us. I agree. Yeah. And I think that the podcasts, Bitcoin, everything's about to take off. So I say it's the Samuel L. Jackson from Jurassic Park moment, the hold on to your butts.
Yes.
It's about to go. Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks so much, Corey. We'll see you on Spaces.